This presentation will focus on the presidential strategies of John F. Kennedy and Lyndon B. Johnson in the Vietnam War. Their approaches will be compared and contrasted for a better understanding of the war's timeline and consequences. Their strategies will be examined for reflection of the changing political, cultural, and societal atmospheres outside of Vietnam throughout the war. In 1960, Democrat John F. Kennedy was elected President of the United States. Kennedy would enter the presidency with hopes, fears, ideas, and the complex issue of Vietnam hanging over his head. Surrounded by young, like-minded advisors, the president's approach to Vietnam and strategy would reflect the changing political, cultural, and societal atmospheres outside of Vietnam. Kennedy was essentially a front for anti-communism, an issue that had begun to divide the world powers. According to authors Gettinger and Gardner, Kennedy and his advisors considered themselves able, goal-directed achievers who favored action. They comprised a youthful, self-confident, and activist generation eager to get the country moving again abroad, as well as at home. They brought energy and imagination to Washington, D.C. They believed in asserting firm, aggressive American leadership in world affairs. That meant moving forward to meet dangers and threats rather than waiting to react to them. This would result in Kennedy utilizing a strategy of gradual escalation within Vietnam. Over a course of time, Kennedy's strategy would allow for the increase of U.S. involvement, including a massive expansion of advisors in-country and more use of U.S. air power and special forces. By 1963, the number of American military personnel in Vietnam had been increased to 16,000. The president helped work alongside the South Vietnamese government to create hamlets where villages of people could seek security and safety. And in 1963, through the CIA, Kennedy took a role in allowing the overthrow of Diem. Kennedy was ready and willing to take on the responsibility of protecting the Republic of Vietnam. His Catholic faith would cause him to take great interest in Catholic Vietnam, and it showed through his actions and his strategy of gradual escalation. In November of 1963, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated, and Lyndon B. Johnson stepped into the role of the presidency. Johnson was immediately faced with decisions to make regarding the American role in Vietnam. By the time of President Kennedy's assassination and the start of the war in 1965, Lyndon's strategy for involvement in Vietnam would not reflect the changing political, cultural, and societal atmospheres outside of Vietnam. While his choices were limited upon the inheritance of the conflict, there were not major pressing domestic or international concerns in security. Americans did not want to lose Vietnam, but they especially did not want to send so many of the young men of the country off to die. Many in government positions felt that any responsibility to the South Vietnamese government had been fulfilled. This was demonstrated in the Congress sessions of early 1965, when majority leaders of both the House and the Senate spoke against continuing gradual escalation. However, Johnson was determined to move ahead and play a stronger defense. In 1965, President Johnson spoke to the American public about the need to continue in Vietnam, and meetings began to happen in regards to strategy. The president and his advisors decided on a course of limited war, with plans to continue in the gradual escalation of American air power and ground forces, with hope for a diplomatic solution. For the course of the war, Johnson's strategy seemed to be to pick and choose battles instead of fighting with a clear objective in mind. This would result in a major strategy failure. By 1968, the course of the war took an even sharper downward turn for President Johnson upon the occurrence of the Tet Offensive. A new stage of the war had begun, but the president made few changes in strategy, which would be disastrous for future American success. President Johnson's political credibility was also on the decline, as seen in the loss of support from his base. In March of 1968, President Johnson announced that he would not seek a second term in office, and the next stage of the Vietnam War would be left to Richard Nixon. There were similarities in the strategies of President John F. Kennedy and President Lyndon B. Johnson. One of the first major similarities was the continuation of presidential advisors. Upon the death of President Kennedy, President Johnson kept his predecessor's top foreign policy advisors. President Johnson's area of expertise was not in foreign policy, and he felt the need to have advisors that were well versed in the situation at hand. His management style of those advisors, however, would differ than President Kennedy's, and that will be discussed later on. President Kennedy's strategy focused on a gradual escalation within Vietnam through the increase of air power and troops. President Johnson would continue that strategy towards the beginning of his time in office, adopting the plans that Kennedy had left behind. This was confirmed 2 days after the assassination, when President Johnson sent word to South Vietnamese leadership through Ambassador Henry Lodge. Later on, Johnson's strategy would evolve into something more wartime specific. While there were similarities between the presidential strategies, there were also differences in how John F. Kennedy and Lyndon B. Johnson handled the war. As previously mentioned, President Johnson took on President Kennedy's advisors, but instead altered the way Kennedy had managed them. Johnson's personal ties to the advisors grew deep, even though some would wane towards the end of the war. At the beginning of his presidency and throughout, Kennedy had the habit of getting rid of any advisor who would not be on his side or who disagreed with him. Kennedy also began his presidency with fresh excitement and ready to take on a war in the world. Johnson, however, was more weary of war, and his hesitancy to make strategy decisions reflected that view. Much like FDR, Johnson did not prefer war and wanted to limit involvement in Vietnam, even though that would not be the case, as seen through the increases in troops. Kennedy, a stark Catholic, was much more willing to jump into the conflict with Vietnam, as he was very preoccupied with the fate of the Catholic nation. Neither president, however, went through Congress for an official declaration of war in Vietnam. They both used presidential and commander-in-chief authority to make military decisions. Johnson relied on Secretary of Defense McNamara to implement a 3-stage strategy for the American ground force during the course of the war. The stages would include key American troop locations, search and destroy tactics, and gradual withdrawal. This plan was never a part of Kennedy's strategy. In regards to their strategy approaches in relation to societal atmospheres outside of Vietnam, President Kennedy was much more in line with American thoughts, while President Johnson continued American involvement in Vietnam despite anti-war sentiments. Kennedy understood and embodied the American distaste for communism and sought to shape his foreign policy around it. Johnson, however, ignored the public's wishes to end the war and save American lives. Both President Kennedy and Johnson played major roles in the Vietnam War, and their legacies left an impact on both respective countries and the future of the American military.